Hi, Chris.
Hey, Reihan, how are you?
Not bad. I am Reihan Salam of the New America Foundation, and I write a blog for National Review, and I'm here with Chris Hayes.
And I'm Chris Hayes. I'm the Washington editor of The Nation magazine and a fellow at the New America Foundation along with Reihan.
So, Chris, I understand you just returned home recently from Turkey, much like my interlocutor, Dio Olapade, yet you were there.
Oh, that's right.
For
You
a
guys,
different purpose.
you're getting a lot of Turkey. No, Dio
love
and I
Turkey,
actually,
so, yeah.
Dio and I were on different legs of the same trip, which was sponsored by the Turkish Cultural Foundation, which is a nonprofit sort of focused on cultural exchange between the U.S. and Turkey, very kind of like studiously non-political. The founder of which, who is a very wealthy man, a Turkish man who moved to the U.S. And started a microchip company that made a ton of money. He also is the sort of chief funder and founder of the Turkish Council of America, which is much more akin to something like AIPAC or other sort of lobbies. They're explicitly sort of lobby on behalf of Turkish U.S. relations, against the Armenian genocide resolution, etc.
Fascinating. Wow.
Yeah, so there's actually a really strong, it's really amazing the amount of resources, energy, political battle that is sort of waged in the proxy war over the sort of Armenian genocide resolution here and in other countries, but also in the broader context of Turkey as an ally, as a member of NATO, its closeness to Israel. So there's a very interesting diplomatic relationship between Turkey and Israel, which has obviously recently become strained with the new AKP party and with Erdogan blowing up at Shimon Peres at Davos, which was kind of an international sensation. While I was in Turkey, they canceled joint military exercises with Israel. They say the relationship remains untouched, but because Turkey and Israel have had this very strong relationship traditionally, the sort of the kind of American Jewish contract, American Jewish Congress and AIPAC forces here in the States have always sort of also lobbied strenuously on behalf of Turkey. So there's a very sort of interesting network of diplomatic interests that are jockeying in Washington around Turkish issues.
I remember during the 1990s when the Turco-Israeli Entente really solidified, there was a lot of talk about how because of, and we discussed this to some degree last week, the Turks were using the strength of AIPAC to lobby sort of for softening various sanctions regarding certain weapon systems, et cetera. But also, Turkey was able to draw on Israel's indigenous defense industry, et cetera, as well. It makes a lot of sense. But I wonder, tell me a bit more about, the kind of détente with Armenia, because, this, of course, as you alluded to, has been sort of a very big issue domestically. And also, kind of one thing that I've heard more recently is that the fact that Turkey has softened its stance towards Armenia has also undermined its relationship with Azerbaijan to some degree, which some see as a kind of more traditional relationship given their kind of, to call them having a shared cultural heritage is perhaps saying too much. But, certainly they had a very close relationship before. So, tell me about, kind of what you gleaned about that relationship.
Well, it's interesting. As far as I can tell, the Turks I talked to sort of greeted the sort of detente between Armenia and Turkey, which just normalized relations the day before I flew to Turkey, with kind of a shrug, a kind of like, we'll see. Part of that has to do with the fact that amongst kind of urban cosmopolitan Turks, what one of this group referred to himself as, quote, white Turks, a term I had never heard before but found fascinating. Amongst that group, the AKP is wildly unpopular. And so I think that the fact that it's wildly unpopular, the way they talk about the AKP is akin to the way that New York liberals would talk about Bush.
Right.
That because of that, it's anything the AKP does is viewed with tremendous skepticism and kind of distaste. So I think in some senses, the fact it was done by the AKP tends to be of larger significance than actually what seemed like from the outside a fairly significant and good diplomatic breakthrough between the two countries. So that was kind of the overriding sense that I got from folks that I talked to there. But again, I was talking to a fairly distinctly unrepresentative group demographically.
I wonder, you mentioned in a tweet something in passing about a social movement, and some would say political movement, that I found incredibly interesting. I believe it's called Gulen, and it's a group of folks who are disciples of a kind of Sufi intellectual, and it's an organization that's really mushroomed in size since the 1970s. Tell me a bit about your impressions and about how pervasive the influence of the Gulen movement is.
So I did not have occasion, except for a few, our tour guide mentioning Gulen. So first I should say that the name is Fethullah Gulen. He is a Sufi imam from Turkey, from the sort of Western Turkey area, and he had a kind of in a kind of Sufi tradition, which very much focuses on kind of these sort of charismatic leader figures and then their disciples. Rumi was sort of the most famous of these. He started in the 1970s, 1980s. He's done some jail time for violating the very intensely strictly secular laws of the state. He got out of jail and he was indicted again, and he came to the U.S. He now lives in basically rural Pennsylvania, which is in and of itself kind of fascinating. There are all sorts of Turkish conspiracy theories about, or maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. I literally don't know, about how the CIA gave him his visa, and there's some relationship between him and the CIA, etc. I have no idea whether that's based in anything or not. But he, while in Turkey, built up this incredibly strong social-religious movement, I would say. It's called the Gulen movement. And I was talking to a very well-connected Turkish businessman on my last night there, having dinner with him, and it has penetrated every part of society. I mean, there are the devotees of him range from members of government to members of the business elite. The police and security forces are notably very penetrated by devotees of the Fethullah Gulen movement. The activities the movement engages in, one of the chief things they do is they build these Turkish language schools, largely through Central Asia. So Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Armenia. They have built Turkish language schools in Iraq for Turkmen there, and Turkish language schools in the country itself. The schools are noted for their rigorous math and science education. Also Turkish language. There's a picture of Ataturk. People learn the national anthem of Turkey. The two sort of strange things about this is a massive social movement. I think maybe the roughest analogy, right, would be like a cross between sort of the evangelical Christian movement in the U.S. and the Falun Gong in China. As hard and then the sort of secularists who are very skeptical of it, I think would say it's much more like, say, the Reverend Moon and sort of the hard right Christian evangelicals than it is like Falun Gong. There's a lot of people, both I think inside the movement without, who say it's more like Falun Gong. The point being that the two things that I think are really interesting about it is that one of the guiding ethos of the movement is that they do not advertise the fact that they are behind whatever they're behind. So there's a sort of Gulen movement-owned bank, but you wouldn't know that if you were interacting with it. There's a Gulen movement-owned daily newspaper called the Zaman, which doesn't advertise it. So to the secularists who are really in Turkey sort of inclined, and I think partly because of the region, partly because of the country's history, to see enemies
in general.
Exactly, to see enemies in the secular state everywhere they look, they really are freaked out and terrified of this. I mean, and Michael Rubin at AEI, who's just about the only American to write about this, he wrote this very sort of fevered, I thought, kind of paranoid column about how Gulen was going to return to Turkey, and it would be like Ayatollah Khomeini returning in 1979 to Iran, that like the throngs of the millions, I mean, there are millions and millions, Turkey's a country of 80 million people, there are millions of devotees of this movement, are going to, take to the streets, and the secular state would be overthrown in a day. To give you a sense, and then I'll shut up, because I've been talking too much, but to give you a sense of the reach of this movement, The Prospect, the UK magazine, The Prospect, not the American one, had an online poll for who are the leading intellectuals of the world, and somehow it was injected into sort of the bloodstream of the sort of both expat and external and internal Turkish communities of devotees of Gulen, and Fethullah Gulen won the poll, and the Prospect editors had to scramble to figure out who the heck the guy was because
something similar
no one had
with
heard
Foreign
of him.
Policy magazine as well, and it's interesting because Turks tend to be very, very active in all of these dodgy online polls. So Ataturk tends to do incredibly well, but when sort of Gulen did well, it certainly did draw a lot of attention, and deservedly so. It's interesting. I was reading a wonderful essay by Susie Hansen that appeared in April of 2009, in which she discussed the Gulen movement at some length, and also just a lot of the perception of kind of religious versus secular politics, what that misses and sort of what it gets in terms of outside observers. And it's interesting because it seems that the Gulen movement, part of its potency, as you suggest, is the fact that they are not aggressively present, and sort of the whole idea is that one is permitted exit. And so when you're thinking about a movement like this, you think, well, to what extent is it cult-like? To what extent does it involve shunning? Exactly. And so there is some talk of how if you don't carry the Zaman newspaper, your newsstand will be boycotted. If you're not attending these meetings, etc. I mean, sort of there are subtle ways in which you lose business contacts and what have you. And it's also interesting that. Oh, please.
No, continue.
Oh, just the way that when they began, I mean, a lot of it was, kind of focusing on and educating Turks who came from disadvantaged backgrounds. And also just the way that, they are not explicitly and avowedly opposed to the secularism of the Turkish state. In fact, they present themselves as believers in Kemalism. When you were talking about the evangelical Christian right, one thing that's interesting is that, there's both this marriage of, obviously, kind of devout religious belief and also ultra-patriotism. And there's something curious when you were talking about, these schools that are scattered across the world. I mean, why would you be teaching, extreme Turkish nationalism in the Central African Republic? There's something a little puzzling about it. But,
I know. There is something. I mean, I think that, Russia actually closed down a few of the schools, I think, because of fears of some kind of anyone sort of trying to foment any kind of, greater Turkish solidarity ethos, communal feeling, across national boundaries. And so Russia shut down some of these schools. But you're right. I mean, this is a sort of broader point about Turkish politics particularly, but I think it's kind of a global phenomenon that I'd be curious to hear you talk about, is that we're used to a lot of different dividing lines in politics that sort of across, say, liberal democracies across the world that are familiar to us. I mean, for me, this kind of I should probably have done something to take my phone off the hook. Let's do that. So we're used to these dividing lines. Left versus right is sort of the most kind of iconic, but what's fascinating about Turkish politics is that the secular religious axis is in some senses the kind of dominant one at this point. I mean, in terms of the sort of which side are you on? Someone even said to me, some sort of Istanbul Turk said to me, sort of referred to like which side he would fight on in the Civil War, if it came between he didn't mean it in a literal sense. He meant it sort of as a kind of conceptual construct that, he was on the side of he was saying that he liked the AKP and he was actually sympathetic to them, but, if it came down to it, right, that he would be fighting on the side of the secularists. So, and I was just at the J Street conference listening to members of the Knesset talk. These are sort of lefty progressive members, largely of the Knesset, and the way that they described the country's internal politics was in kind of similar ways, as a sort of struggle for the power within the state between the secularists and the religious forces.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Susie's article suggested that part of it was because the Turks and Turkish political culture never really grappled with, individualism and the concept of individual freedom. And I found this really interesting because, when you're thinking about the left-right divide, there is a sense in which, the kind of secularists are ostensibly on the left, yet it was a left that was aligned with a military-industrial complex. Yet now you have this, very different environment in which, and this is something that some commenters have kind of objected to, but I mean, my sense is that one of the anxieties, and, Michael Rubin has raised this anxiety, but he's not alone in this regard. One anxiety is that you have the, AK Party having evolved in such a way that it's created a parallel deep state. And I think this is one of the anxieties about Gulen. To what extent, obviously they're not directly tied together, yet to what extent do you have the AK Party, kind of spreading its influence into the courts and other institutions so having been seen as these kind of passive victims and a movement that's trying to modernize Turkey's political culture by creating a kind of quasi-Christian democratic movement, I think that outsiders are inclined to, look favorably on the AK party, and I personally continue to be, inclined to look favorably towards them. Yet, to what extent is actually, are we seeing more corruption, and to what extent are we seeing something that could really undermine, the secularism, not the kind of hard secularism, but even the kind of thin idea that sort of people who are cultural outsiders should have a place in the society, etc.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and it's these tensions that make it very difficult for an American. I was there for 2 weeks. I should say that it's a totally incredible country. I mean, it's endlessly fascinating. The history there obviously is just inordinately rich. Istanbul is one of the greatest cities I've ever set foot in, possibly the greatest city in the world. I would actually say, saying that having been there for 48 hours. But all this complexity means that. Approaching the political divisions within the country, even from a sense of I have this just basic instinct of okay, so who's my posse here? You know what I mean?
Right.
Who are my homies? And the answer to that is the sort of secular left, the Turkish secular left. But the Turkish secular left has been kind of, decimated by a series of things. One is the sort of violence that occurred in the late 70s and 80s, the military coup that kind of, sent a lot of people out of the country, a lot of people into prison. And now the main forces of the country are this secularist military-industrial complex as represented by the army and the generals and the kind of secularist intellectuals who along with the army, view the AKP as a threat to Ataturk's vision of a secular state, and then the kind of populist, Islamic Democrat movement of the AKP. And, for a sort of secular cosmopolitan leftist like myself, it's very hard to figure out which of those whose side I would come down on in that. And not that it matters in any way, but it's
right. The clarity of class politics seems to be really tremendous there, particularly with the AK Party having successfully reached out to the Kurds, yes. And also the Gulen movement having successfully reached out to the Kurds as well. It doesn't map onto the politics, kind of secular. When you're a secular left-winger in the West, you can say that, well, I'm also aligned with the people who are at the very bottom of society, the most kind of dispossessed. Right, yeah. Whereas in Turkey, it's not obvious that that's true, although that could be true in a matter of commitment and principle. Yeah.
There was this great line by the tour guide who was a wonderful woman and incredibly smart and gave us a very. She was, her own politics were incredibly idiosyncratic and sui generis, but she had almost this sort of Pauline Kael about Nixon line about the AKP. She's very Istanbul kind of upper middle class in the European sense, Istanbul middle class, secularist, and she basically was like, I don't know how they won. No one I know voted for them. So
one thing that I find really tragic is that Istanbul is, I understand, an incredibly beautiful city, yet so much of it is built of unreinforced concrete, and if there were an earthquake, as seems fairly likely, it would absolutely. It's also a mammoth city, and so you can imagine it being truly devastated. It's I always
it's about 18 million people metro.
I worry about natural disasters. Sort of silly.
No, I mean,
it's one of these kind of Katrina situations where it's it's predictable that you would get this incredibly miserable outcome.
that is a real fear, I think. Just to close out our Crusades of Reihan Salam Turk Talk, we should make this a weekly podcast. Everybody should Turk Talk with Reihan Salam. Everybody should, obviously. These are very difficult economic times. I was lucky enough to be, flown over there by the Turkish Cultural Foundation, and it's not, super cheap to fly there. But, for people that do have the means to travel, Istanbul and Turkey are just an amazing place. Istanbul as a city is something that, you shouldn't miss. And if you're going to go to Europe, it's not on the euro. It's 1.4 lira to the dollar, so it's considerably cheaper than the rest of Europe. So that's my Turkey plug.
One thing, this I think segues us naturally to talk about a recent essay by Carrie Howley that appeared in Reason regarding libertarianism. Now, why is it a natural transition? Well, in talking about the Gulen movement, this movement that both seems to be kind of open, yet also is this kind of religious movement that kind of involves shunning. It's a religious movement that doesn't necessarily violate one's kind of liberties in the kind of strictest, narrowest sense. Yet there is a sense on the part of many secular liberals that it has introduced new cultural constraints into kind of urban Turkey.
That's right.
And
exactly
this is just a really kind of deep and broad question among libertarians about the extent to which libertarians ought to concern themselves with threats to freedom that are not coming solely in the form of state interventions, but rather that come in the forms of a kind of culture of subordination. And I wonder about your thoughts about this broad issue.
Well, I mean, it's a little hard to engage in good faith in intra-libertarian debates because I'm not a libertarian, and I think that libertarianism as an ideology is limited in precisely in some ways the ways that Carey diagnoses. It seems just prima facie evident to me that there are all sorts of non-state constraints on personal freedom. And obviously, there's no clear analog to the coercive force of the state in the conditions of modern liberal democracy when you're not living in kind of gangland mafia war situation. And I thought Carrie's article was incredibly well written. I'm very sympathetic to it. I guess my point would be once she opens that door, it's very hard to see what left of libertarianism you retain, insofar as her kind of iconic example that begins the essay is a description of a young Chinese woman who migrates from the provinces to a city and gets a factory job, and how the money she earns in the factory job and the fact she's left her family allows her to sort of liberate herself from the sort of social, cultural, normative constraints of rural family life in China, right? That she arranged marriage and all sorts of expectations about what her role would be. But those, and Carey talks about how constraining of individual freedom those can be. But I don't necessarily see a big difference between that and the constraints imposed by a minimum wage job or a $7 an hour job in a factory in which you have, no say or no bargaining power. It's unclear to me what the sort of analytical distinction between those two are, and if there is none, well then we're it seems we're a long way from libertarianism. So that's my initial thought.
There was a paper, I think it was written in the very early 1980s by Anthony Kronman, later the dean of Yale Law School, and I think he's still there, but he does lots of kind of law and philosophy stuff, called Contracts and Distributive Justice. And part of his argument was that at the heart of the libertarian conception is the idea that, an exchange is not a truly free exchange if it involves force and fraud. And one of the questions that Kronman asked is, well, let's think about this idea of force and fraud. What exactly does it mean, and should it entail asymmetries, whether asymmetries of information or asymmetries of power? And if it ought to factor those things in, because again, that is the kind of, motivating factor behind the idea that we object to an exchange that, is embedded with force and fraud, then it radically opens up the spectrum of the kind of interventions that are acceptable on the part of the state to kind of mitigate the kind of use and abuse of these asymmetries of information and power. And it's interesting because, I think that you could take that as a kind of devastating argument against libertarianism. Or you could say, well, yeah, that's right. There is this kind of larger regulatory scope. There's this, larger set of abuses that one ought to be attuned to. Yet libertarianism still has a kind of coherence and meaning because I can't speak on behalf of Carrie Howley, but I think that, the idea that, a libertarian society might require a somewhat thicker state doesn't actually obviate, kind of a lot of the core insights of libertarianism. One thing is that, a lot of left liberals have, in the post-war era, increasingly moved away from the logic of central planning, although, one might argue that the health reform debate suggests they haven't moved far away enough from it. But, moved away from that, and actually there's a greater emphasis on the idea of democratic participation, things that aren't sort of tightly centralized and things that aren't so easily caricatured. And so, kind of where's the difference? And I think that actually means that, well, libertarian insights, libertarian ideas have influenced the left in a useful way, and I imagine that Carrie sees herself as a left libertarian.
I think she does. Again, she explicitly says that libertarianism sort of turned away from the left, and at a certain point to kind of highlight its differences over taxation, corporate power or labor, etc. Look, I guess I would say that the question is, so once you recognize, the first step here is that not all individual choices people make are created equal, right? Which is to say, like, the choice of someone in rural China, a young woman, to kind of, accept the arranged marriage by her family is, if you're simply defining choice by whether the state's doing anything coercive, is as much a free choice as the choice of a young teenage woman in Manhattan to go out and, get a haircut her parents don't like, etc., right? But there are clearly different hierarchies of power at work in both circumstances.
Yeah.
So then once you open up, I think, the question of power and how imbalances of power, hierarchies of power affect these sort of supposedly blank slate individual choices, well, then you get a very complicated terrain. Now, to the extent that you want to, I think you want to preserve some very, I think, important, useful, practical observations that, say, Hayek has about the sort of informational shortcomings of central planning, or, of centralization of power in the state. That's a very different kind of enterprise than the kind of first principles philosophical argument for libertarianism, I think. And I'm perfectly happy as a left liberal to sort of agree with you that there have been certain insights from the libertarian literature insofar as its sort of diagnoses of ways in which state control, central planning bureaucracies can fail that are useful and need to be incorporated.
I guess my reading of Carrie's essay was influenced by my reading of political philosophers like Joseph Raz and these guys who were, so-called perfectionist liberals who believe that actually, they believe in liberty as an end, and in cultivating a liberty-loving culture is a valuable thing. And so when you're thinking about, for example, this kind of deeper libertarianism, the idea of kind of repressive communities, that would be offensive to a perfectionist liberal because of the idea that one ought to be able to form oneself in such a way that, you kind of have this broader context of choice, that it has been narrowed by, your family. And of course, that begs all kinds of questions about the context of choice when it comes to the distribution of material resources, et cetera. One reason why a lot of left libertarians are so invested in the idea of a basic income guarantee, something like that, but otherwise a kind of pretty thin state. I find these ideas really, really interesting. Another thing that I think differentiates the kind of left libertarian from the left liberal is also, and this is something that I know that you think a lot about, but it goes back to this idea of cosmopolitanism. And it's the idea that rather than emphasize the nation state and solidarity within the nation state, you want to have this broader sense of what the human community is and what are the best policies designed to maximize choice and freedom for the human community.
I totally agree, and that was one of the great things about international socialism. I mean, that the sort of consciousness of international socialism was that, and I mean that in the sense of socialism in the sort of European sense, in terms of social democratic parties, and not in the Stalinist sense.
Right. That's an important distinction.
Yes, a very important distinction. There was a way of having a left cosmopolitan consciousness that was simultaneously solidaritaristic but also internationalist, and once that went away, it's incredibly difficult to articulate the politics of, say, opposition to neoliberal trade policies in the American political context in a way that isn't kind of cringe-inducingly Lou Dobbs-ish. And there are people who do it. I mean, if you go to the protests of, the WTO, you will see Mexican farmers and American members of the AFL-CIO together. That's the old kind of solidaritaristic internationalism that defined the left during the period of kind of for much of the 20th century, and it's something that I would like to be able to recapture, because I think what ends up happening in the American context is that it's sometimes it's politically and rhetorically expedient to take this nationalistic shortcut as a means of furthering sort of progressive principles that have this sort of national, the nation state as the kind of bounds of where your solidarity should be directed. And I think it's, I think that's deeply problematic, although totally understandable given the polity that we live in and the sort of exigencies of what you have to do.
Yeah, this is definitely a split between what you might call left libertarianism and right libertarianism, in that I think that there are a lot of folks who are right libertarians who see the nation state as a kind of bulwark against this kind of cosmopolitan class struggle socialism that you're talking about, and the idea of fusionist conservatism was also redolent with this idea that traditional institutions, including the Catholic Church, among many other institutions, kind of folk institutions, and also to some degree nationalism, are kind of effective ways to kind of challenge the power of the state and the idea of this kind of elite that's oriented toward social control. And yeah, it is really interesting, and I think that this is one reason why so many libertarians have found Kerry's argument so problematic and frustrating. I find it less so, just because I think that you could imagine a kind of thinner and kind of less ambitious version of a pro-market politics. And I think of myself as someone who has strong libertarian sympathies, who identifies as a conservative, in part because I guess I'm not an extremely ideological libertarian, and I recognize that there are, or I have a different idea regarding the compromises that one ought to make in moving towards a politics that is more kind of choice-enhancing, market-oriented, etc. I think that... Oh, I'm sorry, please.
Oh, no, continue. Finish your thought, and then I
actually think I was losing my train of thought, so I think you were rescuing me.
I was going to try to somewhat awkwardly, but I thought possibly deftly segue into the topic of both near and dear to both our hearts as proud outer borough New York boys, of a very decidedly, let's say, non-libertarian political figure named Mike Bloomberg, who's kind of become, I feel like, a bête noire to libertarians. I feel like he sort of garnered this reputation as a kind of paternalist in chief, and his re-election efforts in the city that we both grew up in.
Yeah, I wrote a post for my blog at the National Review in which I was suggesting that...
By the way, Reihan, you can't see this, but my colleague Eric just walked in, so...
Oh, yeah, no problem.
Heads, that's Eric. Okay,
hi, Eric. No problem, but I wrote a post in which I was praising Bloomberg and suggesting that while it's natural for conservatives in New York City and outside of New York City to dislike Bloomberg, there's actually much to admire. And Andrew Studiford, who a blogger for The Corner, a very clever blogger, he is notorious for his hatred of Bloomberg. And he was asked about, well, what do you make of this? And he wrote something I thought that was really, really funny. Let me see. He basically said, he basically let loose this kind of incredibly harsh anti-Bloomberg tirade and said, I shall, of course, be voting for him at the end. And it's interesting. I mean, I think that it's, I guess I think of Bloomberg as a guy who, clearly doesn't, kind of share my views on every particular issue. But I also think that, the things that he does in New York City, I'm much more comfortable with him doing them in New York City rather than doing them at the federal level. And I think that, that's part of the genius of decentralized government. And there's a way in which, when you govern New York well, it has these tremendous spillover effects. People always talk about spillover effects in the context of, agglomerations like Silicon Valley, Wall Street, et cetera. But there's also a way in which, New York, because, you draw so many talented people, you're able to have bureaucrats in a place like the Department of Housing Preservation and Development who are just incredibly innovative and smart. And what he's done is unleash them. And, when you pioneer kind of, new...
My father is one of those smart bureaucrats.
And when you have a place that's a hub of experimentation in public policy, then those innovations can spread to other cities, if they work, and they don't spread if they don't work. And, if you look at 311, for example, it's something that has actually made it much easier to be a business owner or to start a business in New York City than had been the case before Bloomberg came into office. Yeah. So I think that, and I also remember, early on when he was incredibly unpopular, when he said things like, well, yeah, we're going to have to raise property taxes, and we're going to have to do this. And my parents said, we just really appreciate this because he seems to be someone who's taking us seriously, and who's trying to be frank about the limits of what he can realistically accomplish. And this is just, something that's increasingly and rather boringly at the heart of my, gut instincts on politics. I mean, just, any politician who's going to tell you, what the honest trade-offs are regarding what it is they have to do, I just, gets a tremendous pass from me. Even John Corzine, someone who I would be very happy to see John Corzine lose re-election, but early on as governor, he tried to explain to New Jersey voters, wait a second, you need to consolidate local government in the state. There's no other way to actually reduce the kind of tax burden you're dealing with. Right. And voters rejected that, and then he kind of moved on. But, and given that he just moved on from that so casually, well, maybe that's not fair to him, but I mean, I just kind of think that if you make that case strongly and forthrightly, and then the public says we don't want to, then actually I think that's a pretty good reason to not run for re-election. You know what I mean? If you can this is the only way to solve this problem. And granted, there are a lot of other things that are at work, but
I agree. But yeah, circling back to Bloomberg, though, I think that it's interesting you mention your parents, because I think that, my parents, your parents and my parents come from very different places, but occupy a somewhat similar sort of place in the very complex fabric of New York. But they, my folks, I think were, well, I would say my parents and their milieu, I was always surprised going back to New York over these Bloomberg years. New York liberals were very supportive of Bloomberg. I think they were skeptical at first, but really came around. I think that largely that was because, like you said, that he did a lot of there was a lot of things that were happening vis-a-vis governing that were really good and innovative and bold and progressive. I mean, in terms of their political valence, I think education is a whole nother story that I'm far more critical of, and we can get into that. But what's fascinating is to talk to liberals now in New York, there's this incredible tension between sort of ends and means, because even if people think that he's been a good mayor and he's governed the city well, there's understandable outrage at the fact that the guy basically went to like the ruling elite of New York City and said, no one else can govern the city like I can. Let's get rid of the term limits. And ran through getting rid of this term limits. It was voted through a referendum. They got rid of term limits, not through another referendum, but through city council, so that he can run again. And now he's outspending his opponent, whose name is Bill Thompson, by the way, for blogging heads, people out there who want to learn more about him. I'm doing a little redistribution here. Thompson2009.com. So you should go check him out. But I don't know what he's outspending. It's something like 30-1. I mean, there is a point at which it really does feel, in a deep sense, like what is happening in New York is really kind of an insult to democracy. I mean, and I would also say provocatively that if someone like Hugo Chavez, when he undertook some, similar machinations to get himself to exceed term limits, everybody thinks this is essentially like a march towards autocracy, and that's in the context of a state and a city. But it's true that like the stunt that Bloomberg pulled, if it was done in the third world, the developing world, we would all kind of sniff at it as like sort of Banana Republic type shenanigans. It's true.
I think that actually we would use those exact words as well. I think that, oh my goodness, I will say that I think you're probably right, and I also think that Bloomberg was right. What worries me is that I think that Bloomberg was probably right to suggest to his elite friends that he's the only person who's capable of governing New York.
Right,
and
but that's exactly, yeah.
You're right that that's a secondary issue, and as a matter of principle, I think that, people have every reason to be outraged, and, the Times had a neat article about the incredible scale of Bloomberg spending. And
it's insane. It's unbelievable.
They seem to suggest that it actually was almost like a one-man stimulus plan for businesses and also for political professionals in New York City. It's just, baffling because clearly, he has 12 to 13 point lead, and, he's not introducing himself, which was his initial logic when he first spent, vast sums. So yeah, it's...
And I should also say that, there's also this, to keep with my international comparisons here, there's also kind of this Berlusconi factor in the sense that, the guy,
please.
Not because of any allegations of Bloomberg using prostitutes or anything like that, but because Berlusconi is the richest man in Italy. Bloomberg is, if not the richest, one of the richest men in New York. He runs. There's a ton of philanthropic dollars tied up in him. I know for a fact, having talked to people in the nonprofit sector, that people are scared of people that rely on nonprofit funding or funding through. Either Bloomberg directly or other sort of affiliated foundations are just generally scared of crossing the mayor. Now, whether that's an accurate perception or not, I can't verify. But there is definitely the perception in the nonprofit circle in New York of fear of crossing the mayor because you don't want to risk your funding. And it at a certain point, it does begin to feel like there's a kind of ironclad. It happens to be the case that he's a pretty competent. A pretty competent governor of the city, but what if he stops being that and he retains all these advantages? It seems kind of scary to me.
I think that one idea that he's raised is that by virtue of not being Democrat, not running on the Democratic line, that is one reason why he has to expend the kind of resources that he does. And I actually don't think that that's trivial, and that's one reason why if he suddenly, became a radically less competent administrator, that we wouldn't have to worry too much about him, being able to use his spending to kind of blunt that advantage. I see what you're saying regarding folks in the nonprofit world, and I kind of think that perhaps they're being a little paranoid, but it's certainly true that Mark Warner, before he ran for governor in Virginia, he similarly, he carefully deployed his private philanthropic activities to kind of help cultivate a political base, for example, by spending a lot of money on historically black colleges and universities, among other things, and also in rural areas. I think there's a difference in scale. Bloomberg is definitely the richest man in New York City, so he has. I think that. So I'm not dismissing these concerns out of hand. And you're right, it's a real puzzle. I wonder, who else is capable of being mayor of New York? When you look at Christine Quinn, when you look at the various borough presidents, Anthony Weiner, when you look at these people, it is a joke, in my opinion. Compared to Bloomberg, in terms of his... One of the things that I admired about Bloomberg early on, and again, this doesn't necessarily reflect my view, but I thought that it was mature, was when he said, well, actually, in terms of looking at what government in New York City does, I think that it actually, does a fair bit of good, and I'm hard pressed to see exactly what we could radically scale back. And I think that that's a more appropriate thing to say at the local level than the federal level. But regardless, he just has a kind of maturity, and so the wealth actually insulates him in a way to say things like that. And that's the whole cliche. And people said the same thing about Corzine and lots of other self-funding candidates. But I really just think that New York, I just cannot. It's such a massively difficult job. It actually begs the question of, do you actually need some kind of charter revision? Is actually New York City too big to fail? And actually, does it sort of suggest that actually we need to break up New York City
too big to fail
so that
in
actually
the
we
70s.
Get people? Oh, I'm sorry, what was that?
I said we weren't too big to fail in the 70s.
Yeah. But we came close, and I just wonder if, actually a more decentralized. I actually think that you're raising sort of really good and deep questions, and then also I think it raises this other question of if Bloomberg is the only person, and again we might disagree about this, but if in my view, Bloomberg is the only person who is capable of governing this kind of large lumbering machine, then does it actually make sense to suggest that the large lumbering machine is itself the problem, and that
let me say this though. I think it's important. I don't know if I necessarily would have predicted that he would be, when he was elected, that he was going to be a very good mayor. I mean, the example that
that's fair enough.
Here, and my point is that people sort of rise to jobs and kind of sometimes are unlikely or surprisingly good at things. The paradigmatic example to me, and I have, for all the people that think Richie Daley's been a great mayor of Chicago, and I have very strong reasons why I don't think that's been the case, but I think that he's proven to be himself to be far more adept and strategic and smart about management than anyone would have predicted from this incredibly inarticulate sort of eldest son of the king state senator who was elected to run Chicago. You know what I mean? So when you say, well, you look around the landscape of New York and the alternatives, Christine Quinn or whoever, is a joke, Richie Daley was a joke as a state senator. The only reason that he was elected was because of his name and his father, and then he sort of blossomed into what a lot of people think has been a very good mayor. I don't think that, but I do think he has been he's shown a knack and competence for sort of management in a way that you wouldn't have predicted. So I think that that's part of the problem, right, of political monopolies, is that...
Right, and creating a political dynasty. Honestly, what I said was so offensive to the ideals of democracy that I almost feel as though I need to apologize to Blogging Heads viewers. I think that is a very fair point. I just find New York City's political class so dispiriting. And then, when you see a guy like David Yaski, who's very slippery, but also sort of pretty competent, again, not a guy that I sort of think that is a sort of a beam of light, but it just it does worry me. But you make an excellent point. I mean, sort of in public management, it's a different set of skills, and there was no reason to predict that Bloomberg would be as good a mayor as he is. But I mean, these guys are ridiculous.
I have to say, I really do miss New York politics. It is a world in and of itself, and I miss being able to sort of be embedded in it the way I once was.
One thing that you were saying, though, it's interesting when you're talking about Daley. I mean, part of it is also that Daley obviously was able to draw on this incredible network, this incredible social network that allowed him to kind of help, knuckle people under, and sort of, it gave him sort of access to the levers of power that someone who kind of doesn't have the same kind of network couldn't. And this actually goes back to just, briefly to New Jersey. Chris Christie, the Republican candidate for governor, is saying things in his campaign, is making promises that strike me as hilariously unrealistic, that strike me as offensive to my intelligence. Yet at the same time, what a lot of people say about him is that kind of for all of his foibles, he's someone who knows Trenton, whereas Corzine doesn't. And you wonder if that's the thing you need to look for. I mean, people who actually know how to make the levers of administration work, and that sort of raises all kinds of questions about kind of we as a political culture love outsiders. Yet it could be that it's actually kind of insiders of whatever stripe. I mean, and not necessarily political dynasts or billionaires. But insiders who kind of are practiced in the art of how to make government work. That maybe that's what we should be looking towards.
Yeah, and that's the sort of argument that you hear. I mean, if you talk to Californians about term limits there, and I think also there was an argument to be made about term limit. I mean, we should know that the term limit law in New York, which was passed by referendum, had, at least in the Bronx particularly, had a very sort of unintended consequence of simply creating dynastic seats. So everyone who was term limited out was just succeeded by their son or daughter. So it was hardly struck a blow for unlikely people occupying the seats of power. So, but no, that's this. Institutional knowledge is important, clearly, and in governance. And
don't think I didn't pick up, by the way, on the fact that in attacking both Bloomberg and Berlusconi, you were clearly attacking short men. And I resent this, and I think that it's deeply offensive, and you'll be hearing from my lawyers. But that's
also sucks Sarkozy. I hate that guy.
Wait, so if you had a vote, would you vote for Bill Thompson on the grounds that Bill Thompson, A, can possibly win, and B, Bloomberg's power grab is so offensive to you?
Yeah, I would. I mean, it would be I think, here's one thing I actually think yes, I would vote for that. I think, actually, to be honest, as a check on overreach, that there would actually be practical, real-world differences between a Bloomberg elected with 65% and a Bloomberg elected with 55%. And I probably would choose the latter, Yeah. So, yes. Now, if you said to me, you are king of the universe for a day, and you wave a magic wand, would you have Bill Thompson be the next mayor of New York or Mike Bloomberg? That would be a very, very tough call.
One thing that I wonder about, and this relates to kind of the issue of how much Bloomberg spends, et cetera, do you think that New York City should have nonpartisan elections? Because it's interesting, like in Seattle, where you have, the city is overwhelmingly Democratic and national elections, yet you actually do have pretty competitive elections at the local level because they're nonpartisan elections. And so you have folks who are on the far left of the spectrum, folks who are, kind of would characterize themselves as kind of Clintonite centrists running against each other in pretty competitive elections. And I wonder if actually New York City would have a healthier political culture. I mean, the one thing, there are advantages to parties and to organizing and what have you.
Yes.
But I wonder if
in New York,
actually having more competitive elections would be enough.
Yeah, I mean, in New York, they tend to be these kind of ossifying, there's very entrenched, as in, a lot of major cities, they're very entrenched kind of machines. And I think that, I would like that. I mean, one thing that, we don't get on the national level kind of parliamentary system, so we don't have Green parties or, right-wing nationalist parties or whatever, Christian evangelical parties in our national politics. It would be nice to have a sort of diversity of ideological diversity, or at least sort of partisan diversity at these local levels, because, it would also, I think, it would introduce some much-needed kind of opening of the political duopoly, as Ralph Nader calls it.
I'm sympathetic to that. We don't have a huge amount of time, which stinks, because we should definitely talk about financial reform. Nate Silver had a blog post recently about how he thinks that the battle over financial reform will become the key contest of the first half of 2010, after, I guess, health reform and some other things clear the decks. What do you buy that? Do you think that financial reform is going to become something that really resonates? I think it's correct legislatively in terms of the way the sequencing is working. I am unhappily dispirited and somewhat not... I don't see the necessary mechanisms in place to convert this very technical legislative battle into a big political fight that grassroots can rally around. Now, I think there's a chance that that's going to develop, and I really hope it does, because I think the outcomes are not going to be great regardless, but I think they're going to be really bad unless that happens. But as of yet, look, I cover this for a living. I follow the markup. This is my job, is to pay attention to this, and I have a hard time following just what's going on in the Barney Frank's committee bill, and what is good and what's not. Now, if I have a hard time, what the heck is everyone else supposed to do when people who have jobs and families?
They're not paid to follow this all the time. So, the complexity and kind of opacity are great friends of Wall Street and the status quo. And there's got to be. I've been in conversations with a lot of people about how to break that down, but that. One of the great things about, the health wonks are constantly talking about how the public option is misunderstood by people that are both fighting it and rallying for it, and that, it's not as central to reform as the proponents make it out to be. You hear this from the White House, you hear it from smart health policy wonks like my friend Ezra Klein. But the fundamental political truth is that in a very complicated legislative landscape, the public option became something. It became the vessel for democratic engagement in a political battle over self-governance. And to me, that is incredibly crucial. And there is no, as of yet, version of that in financial reform. It looked like it was going to be the Consumer Products the CPFA. I forget what the acronym stands for. It's unclear whether that's going to be it. But without some kind of rallying point that is clear to people, it's very difficult to have a kind of broad mobilization. And that broad mobilization, I think, is necessary to have a political battle on the scale that Nate is talking about.
Yeah, this is something that is a source of a lot of concern to me. I mean, I don't fully understand the legislation regarding derivatives trading, but my crude understanding, and also kind of when I look to a lot of the folks I trust on the issue, is that sort of suggesting that sort of a lot of over-the-counter derivatives should in fact be traded on exchanges seems like the bare minimum of the kind of regulation that we need.
Yes.
And the fact that only one Republican on the Financial Services Committee voted for it strikes me as pretty dispiriting.
Isn't that remarkable?
Well, but
it's
I'm kind of hesitant.
Ryan.
Please.
It's not even, this is not, trading something on an exchange is like, that's not it's just really hard for me to see how, even from a principled perspective, I mean, it's not even an ideological issue, to be totally honest. It's like whether you have over-the-counter trading or derivative trading, from an ideological perspective, over-the-counter trading or exchange trading, from an ideological perspective, it's like there's not really any ideological skin in that game. It's just that the banks think they profit more off over-the-counter trading, and standardization will mean less profits, which it probably will. But I just can't imagine not supporting the exchange. I mean, I think
there are a lot of issues at work, and I think that I wouldn't be surprised if there is some, kind of very legitimate objection that people have to the broader regulation. Perhaps they agree with the idea of placing them on exchanges as a matter of principle. I mean, it's hard to say, and I'm sort of not willing to kind of dismiss the objections out of hand. What I will say is that I think that uniform capital regulations also strike me as something that's incredibly, incredibly important. And a lot of the things that I consider kind of baseline minimal interventions that you need to have, that I think that actually people who are, kind of staunch free market devotees like myself should want to see. I think that there's actually a danger in not backing that stuff, because I think that you're more likely to see kind of very crude interventions that are kind of more structural in nature, more cosmetic in nature. And I think that, Silver in his post suggested that you were going to see this kind of split between those who want to break up the banks and those who want kind of heavier regulation. And the thing is that, that latter camp, I mean, there's a lot of interesting debate to have. And I am hoping that it's interesting because, like, what does it mean if this doesn't become a frontline issue that really resonates with the public? Does that actually mean that Republicans have more freedom and flexibility on the substance of the issue, or does that mean that they have less? I mean, it's very, very hard to tell. But I mean, I think that if you're trying to construct, and this is obviously my parochial interest, but if you're trying to construct kind of what should be the position of the more conservative political party or conservative members of Congress, I just really think that you want to emphasize something that is transparent, that is neutral across organizations, and that actually encourages kind of decentralized knowledge to do its work. And part of what was so alarming about the evolution of the kind of financial sector is that it actually became very tightly centralized in a way that actually made it very hard for markets to do their work. So I think that seems to be like a bulletproof case. I mean, we're oversimplifying the issues. I'm oversimplifying the issues a little bit, but I think that is the right way to approach it, and it is pretty dispiriting.
Well, we'll devote our next blogging heads to a full after Trump talk.
I would enjoy talking this, but I think that actually, I think that we kind of come at it from sort of different places, but I think that there's a lot to talk about. Thanks so much for chatting, Chris. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, man. It was good to talk. This is let's talk again soon in the non-blogging heads format.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, dude.
Take care.